One, restore Black culture, the poverty mindset. One of the biggest challenges that African Americans face is that our substandard economic conditions have created a poor mentality within us, which leads us to create poor habits and, unfortunately, foster poor relationships. Many African Americans identify with poverty, thus creating a fear of loss that surrounds money. Since there is so little of it, or at least we think there is so little of it, we get used to operating in the poverty vein, using shortcuts to get by. And in some sick and twisted kind of way, we feel that this is how we are supposed to be. This perspective is only perpetuated when we see many other Black people living in the projects and operating within its network with complacency. Since many of us as African Americans come from poverty stricken areas where there are mainly people who look like us, we have learned the idea that ghetto-ness equals Blackness. These things cause us to subconsciously form an internal definition of what Blackness is or what it means to keep it real by being in the hood. Now, in my opinion, ghetto-ness equals Blackness couldn't be any further from the truth. But I certainly understand where the idea comes from. I'm not saying that all Black people come from the ghetto, but typically all American ghettos contain Black people. Therefore, some African Americans tend to identify with the idea that those things define Blackness. When I was a child, I would catch slack from my Black friends because I grew up in an upper middle class neighborhood. They would make subtle, smart comments implying that I was less Black than they were. After all, you can't be Black and have money too, because that would make you white. At least, that's how they viewed it. If you think that not having money is what makes you Black, then you'll never really acquire wealth. Your loyalty to your Blackness will make you feel less Black or true to yourself. This is just a psychological trap. Most human behavior is learned behavior. And with the help of social programming, many within the African American community learn to think and act poor. We as a people never progress because we never establish enough to pass on. So each generation is starting over from the beginning. I think this is largely because we are mostly consumers, not producers. Although some of this is mentality, the reality is that when you are living close to the poverty line, you tend to consume everything you have, including food, money, and assets. When there's barely enough to live on today, most people don't even think about putting something aside for tomorrow. When this occurs, it keeps the focus on immediate needs, which often turns into a mentality of selfishness or envy. Oftentimes, when we see another brother or sister in business, the thought becomes, what kind of hookup can I get from them? Rather than, how can I support them, assuming they are selling a good product or service? This also translates generationally. As an African American culture, we do not think it is necessary to provide a financial foundation for the next generation. On the other hand, in the white culture, it is almost a given that the previous generation will have laid a solid financial foundation for you. For example, a representation of this generational concept came to me during my early years in business when I was an insurance agent. I remember selling life insurance to families, and during that time, I noticed something interesting. When I would recommend a $100,000 policy to my Black clients, their response would usually be, why would I leave them that much money? But when I offered the same $100,000 policy to my white clients, their response would usually be, what am I supposed to do with that? I'm going to need to look at least $500,000 for my family. Going back to my original point, this psychological paradigm comes from a position of generational lack, which creates a mentality of me first or living only in the now, which leads me into my next topic, the sellout concept. The real problem with many of us, not all, but a large enough portion for it to be significant, is that we really don't know how to be successful. Since Black people have been down for so long, many of us, whether we want to admit it or not, equate success, particularly financial success, with being less Black or more white. This is especially true if that success was not achieved through sports or entertainment. There's a stigma in the African American community that suggests The more hood you are, the more black you are. And the less hood you are, the less black you are. Because what it takes to be financially successful in the business world, corporate world, or mainstream America requires you to act and think outside of that internal definition of blackness, which, if we can keep it real, really means not being hood. Many of us consider these steps to be actions taken only by sellouts. Who exactly is classified as a sellout? The idea of what it means to be a sellout can be perpetuated by the one who seeks to achieve success or improve his or her status in society by getting a nice corporate job with great health insurance or moving into a nice house in the suburbs, maybe even by the one with the designer clothes, shirt tucked in, pants pulled up on the waist, a college education, and a proper English dialect. Not only are these individuals often seen as sellouts to their own race, they may also be considered just plain corny or square. For example, if a young black person grows up and doesn't particularly have an urban style, and let's say he tucks his shirt in, wears his pants on his waist, speaks proper English, and grows up in a house in the suburbs, oftentimes that person would be looked upon as less black. Since the days of slavery, white people were the only ones who had anything or could acquire anything. At the time, African Americans were taught that they should not have or own anything, not to mention that they were legally prohibited from doing so anyway. Over time, this idea contributed to a cultural mentality that, to some degree, suggests how things should be. This has created a big problem within a large portion of black communities. As soon as a person reaches a certain level of success, certain people feel that they can no longer relate to that successful person. Another bad paradigm.
My method is simple. I have outlined a number of differences among the slaves and make the differences bigger. I use fear, distrust, and envy for control. Then there is intelligence, size, sex, size of plantations and status of plantations, attitude of owners, whether the slaves live in the valley on a hill, east, west, north, south, have fine hair, coarse hair, or is tall or short.
Excerpt from the Willie Lynch letter. Now, you may disagree and say that this is not true because these are things that you prefer to acquire. But think about it. How many times in your life have you tried to transcend the status quo, especially among black people, and heard words similar to, "Oh, you think you're better than us now"? Maybe you have heard of the concept of talking black or talking white. It may be understandable to say such a thing if a person happens to use common phrases indicative of one group or another. However, just because a person speaks properly doesn't mean that they talk white. To do so would imply that black people should speak improperly. This is just another concept that keeps us from getting further ahead in America. Control the language.
Crossbreeding complete. For further severance from their original beginning, we must completely annihilate the mother tongue of both the new nigger and the new mule and institute a new language that involves the new life's work of both. We know language is a peculiar institution. It leads to the heart of people. The more a foreigner knows about the language of another country, the more he is able to move through all levels of that society. If you take a slave, if you teach him all about your language, he will know all your secrets, and he is then no more a slave, for you can't fool him any longer.
Excerpt from the Willie Lynch letter. The harsh reality of it is that Europeans or white ideals are what shaped American culture. So many of today's acceptable standards in terms of apparel, diction, and mannerisms are shaped from a white person's point of view. Again, this is not a stab at white people. Those are just the facts. For example, a hip-hop mogul can show up to his office in jeans and sneakers. He can do this because the hip-hop space, which was created by African Americans, is one in which this attire is appropriate. As African Americans, we can see icons such as Russell Simmons and Sean Combs, etc., who are intelligent and who may have some business about themselves as examples of such. This is only possible because hip-hop culture was shaped by African Americans, and culturally, There's a tendency to accept our own just as they are. On the other hand, if you were to show up to a job interview in corporate America or at a networking function in the same attire, it would not be acceptable. This is not to say that you should not wear a suit to an interview. It is simply to point out that every structure in our society has been formed by the dominant race, white Americans. The drawback in certain areas of Black society is the more you clean yourself up and do things that fit into American culture, the less your own people feel they can relate to you. That is the catch 22 about being an African American in a white dominated culture. Dark skin versus light skin.
I have outlined a number of differences among the slaves and make the differences bigger. I use fear, distrust, and envy for control. The second is color or shade. You must use the dark-skinned slaves versus the light-skinned slaves, and the light-skinned slaves versus the dark-skinned slaves.
Excerpt from the Willie Lynch letter. How often have you heard the phrase, "She is pretty for a dark-skinned girl"? Or maybe you have noticed that there seems to be preferential treatment amongst African Americans when it comes to those of a lighter complexion, especially during the dating process. You often hear jokes about being so black or so dark, but seldom about being too light. It is not that one should be made fun of because they are light skinned, but it shows that there is a deep rooted prejudice toward darker individuals. These concepts are also perpetuated in the media, and for that, among many other reasons, many dark skinned people feel self conscious about who they are. This could partly be because many individuals within their own culture often disregard them in many settings and look at them as less attractive. It is important that Black people begin to realize that we initially developed into many different shades because our women were bought as slaves and raped by their slave masters.
Crossbreeding niggers means taking so many drops of good white blood and putting them into as many nigger women as possible, varying the drops by the various tones that you want, and then letting them breed with each other until another cycle of color appears as you desire.
Excerpt from the Willie Lynch letter. While these are terrible atrocities that happen to slaves, we still must realize that as a result of these actions, African Americans have developed into a variety of beautiful people who come in all shades of the color spectrum. Our shade of blackness should not make us more or less valuable. In my opinion, it is our shade of blackness that makes us an extremely beautiful people. Hip hop music, how it is molding our children. Hip hop music, often known as the voice of the streets, is a very influential part of African American culture, more so than any other. Rappers and hip hop icons are some of the leaders of African American youth. I have found that most other cultures view hip hop as just entertainment. However, most African American youth view it as an entire culture and use it as an instruction manual on how to think, act, dress, and ultimately how to live. This is because of many factors, the main being the similarities between the youth and the hip hop artists. Because these individuals look like them and typically come from the same areas and environments that these youths come from, they are inclined to relate to them on a serious level. The artists are also promoting a lifestyle that is much more attractive than your average go to college, get a job, and work hard until you are 65. With the catchy tunes that hip hop offers and the repetitive messages, both visual and verbal, in addition to conditioning from their environment, African American children are constantly repeating self-affirmations of how to think and act based on what they see. This becomes self-fulfilling over time. For example, if an adolescent consistently hears about making money in the streets, excessive drug and alcohol use, and promiscuity from individuals who are just like them, these ideas will begin to manifest in their lives. With so many babies being born out of wedlock and the absence of Black men in the home, rappers have become the father figures for many Black male and female youth. For young men, these rappers are cultivating a new idea of what manhood should encompass. They are also teaching young girls what kind of men they should desire and exactly what to do to get those types of men. I enjoyed my college years at a historically black college and university, HBCU. This idea of how the hip hop culture was shaping our youth became apparent to me during my college party experiences. I would watch the classiest women, who to some people were considered stuck up because they were untouchable to them by day, turn into the most uninhibited, gyrating freaks who practically had sex on the dance floor with whoever came near for all to see. But they were just doing exactly what the songs told them to do. It was clear to me that they had been practicing these moves for quite some time. I noticed much of this during my freshman year of college by watching my fellow female classmates. This means they had to be engaging in this type of behavior since they were teenagers. As a matter of fact, I actually know this to be true. Growing up, the thing for my crew and me to do was to go skating every Saturday from 8 p.m. to 1 a.m. From 12 midnight to 1 a.m., the skating rink turned into a club for teens. Young girls were dancing exactly the way they do in the videos. What makes this so crazy is that we were only 12 or 13 at the time. I literally watched otherwise cute, around the way girls turn into your favorite video vixen when their favorite songs came on. And this was way before we were even old enough to think about driving. Both in college and during my teenage years at the skating rink, I watched fights break out when certain songs, often referred to as crunk music in the South, played at the party. People would often stir up violence that would spill over into the streets after the party and last all evening long. They would do this for no reason at all, except that they were heavily intoxicated and were following the rules laid out for them by the lyrics of the songs they were listening to. I guess the music told them to. Being a huge fan of hip hop music myself, I don't think it is all bad. As a matter of fact, it's the only kind of music I listen to. And truthfully, I don't mind a little bit of an edge in my music. Since life isn't straight and narrow, the last thing I want to listen to is someone who is perfect or too straight and narrow all the time. So I'm not slamming the culture by any means. I am just conscious of the psychological and sociological effects of it, and therefore I'm not brainwashed by some of the more negative aspects of it. Hip hop music is a critical part of African American culture. However, let's be honest, what is promoted on a mainstream level is usually the worst and most ignorant of its kind. Hip hop culture, or at least the street element of it, has been somewhat used as an advertising platform or propaganda media for the prison industrial complex. In many cases, this element promotes a lifestyle that will land you in someone's private prison system, modern day slavery, while your favorite rappers and their affiliate corporations get rich off your destruction. There are some individuals who live a street life because they have come from that environment. However, you have many people who don't even come from the environment who act as if they do. This is simply because we are all molded by the same messages. There is often the argument that movies do the same thing and portray the same images as in hip hop, yet they never get criticized. This is very true. However, the difference is that actors let you know that they are acting. They actually step out of character. Most rappers have the same claim to fame. This isn't just music to me, this is my real life. But when confronted about it, their story changes to, well, it's only entertainment. This confuses the public. Clean up the environment that creates gangster culture. While I do believe in free speech, I also believe in personal responsibility in the messages that you deliver. Now, I don't completely blame the rappers themselves for this. We must remember, they are a product of the same dysfunctional environment that our youth are a part of today. Most of them grew up without fathers and are from broken homes themselves. They were influenced by the same things that influences our youth today. If you look closely, you will find that many rappers name themselves after drug dealers: Scarface, Capone and Noriega, Nas Escobar, Rick Ross, 50 Cent, etc. This is because these were the heroes of their day. Many rappers who are hot today came up during the 80s, during the crack epidemic, And the hustlers were the ones who had the bling, the cars, and the girls. This shaped their views of success, which is all the stuff you see promoted in the videos today. Those hustlers were the rappers of that day. Today's music and culture is still a result of that epidemic and era. The only difference is that it's promoted to every home in America, especially in the Black community, both the inner city and suburbs alike. Many activists and protective parents would argue that rappers need to clean up their lyrics and be more responsible for what they say. We must look at cleaning up the environment that is creating individuals with destructive mentalities and behaviors. Everyone wants to complain about the fruit, but no one is willing to do anything about the tree that is producing the fruit. As an example of environmental influences, when I was growing up, I went to a small Catholic school, even though I'm not Catholic, for elementary school before I switched to a public school for middle and high school. For some strange reason, it seemed that almost all Catholic schools were located in the heart of the ghetto, and mine was no different. For that reason, most of the people who went to that school came from that area. I had a best friend during those years who was a young Hispanic male. He grew up in a neighborhood that happened to be a gang war zone and had a father who spoke very little English and worked all the time. If my memory serves me correctly, I believe his mother was dead and his older brother was serving a 10-year prison sentence for selling guns. He used to come to school all the time with jail stories from his brother, who would call him every so often. I vividly remember when he came to school with a black eye and bruises on his face. When I asked him what happened, he revealed to me that he had been jumped into a gang, a term meaning initiated, the night before. From that day on, he would come to school and share his war stories with me about his gang activity and what he had to do to put in work in his hood. These newfound street connections now gave him, and consequently me as his best friend, access to anything he desired, from drugs to guns to weapons, which he stashed outside in the schoolyard so he could get home safely after school, and anything else he could get his hands on. As a matter of fact, he gave me my first switchblade pocket knife that he had bought off the street. The sad part is that we were only in the 5th grade. While he was not black, but rather Hispanic, he came from an area where both blacks and Hispanics reside. But coming from a broken home, the gang became his new family. This is why we must start by working in the streets of the inner city, which is a breeding ground for destructive behavior because of lack of choices, education, and economic freedom. We can start this by creating more inner city mentorship and coaching programs that work with African American youth in totality in terms of academics, economics, discipline, mannerism, and most importantly, mentality. I'm not talking about just another rec center for them to hang out in and play sports. I am instead talking about a place in which our youth can obtain the tools that they need to survive. To accomplish this, we will need the help of the elders in the community, but the elders have to be able to communicate to the youth. Why the elders can't reach the youth? The main reason why the older generation is not reaching the younger generation is very simple. Their message is way too serious. People in general, especially the youth, really just want to have fun. At every male empowerment summit meeting or lecture I've attended that was taught by a person of an older generation, there was too much time spent fussing and preaching about how I needed to wear my pants up to my eyelids and how I needed to move towards a life that seemed less than interesting. Those types of things are not, have never been, and will never be interesting to young people. Unfortunately, this message is not powerful because the messenger is not living the life he is talking about. However, the rappers and athletes these kids are seeing are living the lives they're talking about and making it very desirable. Overall, we have failed to attach the message of empowerment to an attractive lifestyle. And this is where hip hop has succeeded. If you really look at what has the attention of the youth, it's lifestyle. And the hip hop culture has done an excellent job of selling this. While we know that truthfully, some of the things involved in this lifestyle can be destructive, the bottom line is that the idea of having a bunch of money and lavish things is very appealing. The idea being sold by today's elders is completely unattractive. On the contrary, the sports, drugs, and entertainment businesses are showing teenagers that they can achieve the same things with just their talents and abilities. Elder idea: go to college, get a job that you probably aren't going to like, and end up marrying someone who is probably the opposite of what you see as appealing. This goes against natural human desire. As we say in marketing and advertising, don't sell the steak, sell the sizzle. We have to make it look cool to do the right thing. And that starts with having a younger voice who can attach doing the right thing to an attractive, productive lifestyle. The moment you show up with gray hairs in your beard, slacks, a silk shirt, and a Kango hat, the youth automatically feel like they can't relate to you. This causes a huge disconnect. We have to make it exciting and interesting to do better, not just some heavy responsibility that is all bestowed upon us like the Ten Commandment tablets. Yes, we are discussing serious issues that need to be dealt with, but we need to ease up a bit in our message. We must make it look cool to do the right thing. In other words, lighten up. Being Black in America is like being a left-handed person in a right-handed world. The bottom line is that African American culture is sometimes very different, and in many cases, a direct opposite of the mainstream world. I have always made the example that being Black in America is like being a left-handed person in a right-handed world. Everything is made for right-handed people, including the scissors, the paper cutters, even the buttons on an elevator are on the right side. Just as everything in America is made for right-handed people, not left-handed people, we must also remember that everything in America is made for the dominant race, white Americans. Everything, from the mass media that you see to the so-called industry weight standard that classifies obesity, is made from a white perspective. What we need to do here is to not try to attack the system solely on the premise that it needs to change. What we should be doing is to begin creating cultural institutions to cater to our community. Everything from banks, grocery store chains, health and wellness institutions, all the way to schools and specialized universities for both adults and children. The Restore Black Culture Action Plan, Community Action Plan. Step 1. Research the great thinkers and inventors of African American culture to regain a sense of our cultural pride, including what we've been through and everything we've accomplished. Step 2. Teach African American history at home. Show the progression of our culture and include the positives and negatives that have shaped our past and where we are today. Step 3. Put less emphasis on the difference in the Black community and put more emphasis on the similarities in the Black community. Promote a sense of collective identity and do everything you can to get away from the us versus them mentality. Step 4. Create and fund Black and privately owned elementary, middle, and high schools in our community, similar to how HBCUs are created for Black college students. This is not a segregation concept. This is meant to have a strategic focus on young and, in many cases, underprivileged African Americans who need to be taught from an African American perspective. This would give them a sense of self-identity and help prevent them from slipping between the cracks of the traditional school system. Step 5. Clean up the environment, or at least the poisonous aspects of the culture. It does no good to only worry about the fruit and do nothing about fixing the tree. Create more mentorship programs that teach actual life skills for both African American boys and girls, above and beyond just typical after-school or sports programs. These mentorship programs must serve the purpose of systematically molding youth into socially and intellectually advanced adults. Personal action plan. Step 1. Find at least one area of expertise that you will master. An example, economics, politics, health, etc. Become an expert on that subject and employ the principles that you learn. Step 2. Find at least one person this week to begin to mentor. The mentorship process is crucial to restoring Black American culture. Step 3. Create and start your own mentorship program that can offer guidance on a one-to-many basis.